Okay. Hi, this is Shock Exchange, and this is Trump and the GE, where we discuss the president's policies and how they affect the economy and the community. I have with me Tony and Mitchell, of course. This we haven't done this in a while. We haven't done a show on the specifically on the economy in a while. We spoke about some investment opportunities that we want to make our subscribers aware of, which seems to be going pretty effectively. But today we'll discuss how the Fed is actually spiking the assets of Jerome Powell, some of its and some of the Fed governors, which I don't think they're really supposed to do. But at a 20,000 foot level, again, I don't think the economy is that strong. I thought the economy prior to the pandemic was pretty weak. It had been stalling. If you look at the vital signs of the economy, like rail traffic has stalled. Actually, it was actually declining. Rail traffic was actually declining, which is a key indicator, which means that businesses aren't shipping goods and services across country like they had been before. You look at Federal Express and UPS, they had been reducing their purchases of aircraft, which means that they weren't expecting to send materials around the globe as much as they had been. So the pandemic, in some ways, was actually a boon to UPS and FedEx because everybody was shipping things, everybody was buying things, and having them delivered. So it was actually a mini boon to FedEx and UPS. But the industrial production had stalled. Industrial capacity was way less than 100%, around 78%, which means that it was implied that businesses were not really investing in property, plant, and equipment as much. They weren't churning out these heavy machinery like farm equipment and automobiles because there may not be an end user for it. If they don't think it's going to be purchased or going to be used, why produce it? So the economy is consumers are about 67% of GDP, and consumers kept spending. They've been spending for the past decade leading up to the pandemic, and they had kept the economy robust. They kept GDP up, and it seemed like the consumer had not gotten the message that the economy wasn't that strong because they were kept spending like wildfire. The question remains: will they spend after the pandemic? So the pandemic maybe would have been a precursor that shows that hey, the economy is really not that strong, and how many people can really go one or two paychecks and still survive, and not without 1 or 2 months or without a paycheck and still survive. So consumers likely would probably squirrel. I would imagine they would squirrel away as much capital as they possibly could and not spend as much as they had been spending previously. So that implies that after the pandemic, consumer spending, which had previously driven GDP, may not be the driver that it once was. And the fact that now you see President Biden trying to get a $3.5 trillion infrastructure package approved. This is after a decade of money printing, a decade of tax cuts. It shows the economy really is weak, and unless you provide stimulus on top of stimulus on top of stimulus, it's not gonna improve. So the fact that the government keeps providing stimulus, keeps pushing for stimulus, shows you that the economy is really not that strong, even after all the money printing and spiking of assets over the past decade. And as an aside, I always recommended that we invest in infrastructure. So these kids and I from the New York Stock Exchange were blogging about it, and I put it in a book. And guess what? Guess who recommends it? President Obama. We need to invest in infrastructure, but he never mentioned it before that. So I always thought infrastructure investment was a good idea, but not in addition to money printing and bailouts of Wall Street. So now it shows that the money printing and bailing out Wall Street and spending $30 trillion and putting it into the hands of very few people is not working. So that's sort of my take on the economy at a high level. If consumers don't spend as much as they had been previously, it may be a harbinger of things to come.
Yeah, man. I mean, I think, unfortunately, not much has changed in a positive direction since the last time we chatted about the economy. I think we took a little bit of a break because, how many times can can you, articulate a gloom and doom report pretty much, and constantly have politicians and elected officials continue to focus on their own interests and looking at their own political careers and viability at the sacrifice of their constituents. Since then, obviously pre-pandemic, we stood on the soapbox, which at this point, I feel like I've been on this soapbox for close to a decade, constantly simply looking at the metrics, not doing anything special, not, sprinkling any magic dust. But we knew that a recession was going to come again. And the thought was that it was likely going to be worse than 08, 09. Analysts across even the banking sector jumped on that bandwagon around 2014, 2015. We heard that from the likes of Citigroup, from B of A, from Merrill, et cetera, like the list went on and on. No one, at least anyone that I was reading, any scholarship that I came across, had the recession pegged to a pandemic. There were folks that have stated that a pandemic was coming at some point, but to peg it to economic activity, just didn't put those two together in the same same phenomenon. So long before the pandemic, we can't blame the pandemic for the economic fallout that we're looking at. To me, this economic fallout would have come whether pandemic or not. The exacerbation of how quickly that fallout happened, that's where the pandemic becomes an exacerbator. Because would we have watched effectively a 30% drop in the labor market in the first 4 months of a non-pandemic driven recession? Well, that's an argument that, you can kind of debate all day long. But I think it obviously had significant consequences by interrupting supply chains, interrupting logistics, interrupting the face-to-face jobs that had to be conducted. And we watched a significant shift in the labor market. And to me, the biggest indication of how well an economy is doing, away from the language of an economist, away from the data points of, again, economists, even sociologists, anthropologists, behavioral scientists, and the like, when we just put it in plain terms that everyday people can understand, we look at the labor market. Do you got a job or do you not have a job? Can that job you have put food on the table, roof over your head, clothes on your back? Do you got to get a second job to fulfill those basic needs? Can you pay your rent with one job? Can you afford to take care of your children with one job? Do you have decent health care with one job? If you have to, if the answer is no to all the above, and you got to get more than one job, well, then in very plain terms, it's a weak economy. If you have to start requiring the majority of folks cannot afford where they live, and this is irrespective of being in cosmopolitan areas such as San Fran, New York, DC, Miami, and we're talking about even rural America, heartland, being out in the middle of Ohio, Idaho, places that arguably most folks look at as much more affordable than popular urban centers.
Or places that the hedge fund managers and private equity firms haven't discovered yet, right?
There you go. And I don't think that there is a place in America left that private equity and some of the largest asset management firms on the planet haven't infiltrated and penetrated those markets. As we noted already, that there is an attempt to effectively purchase the housing market, and the way that our economy is set up, there's nothing really to stop any private entity from pursuing what seems to be a almost an impossible feat. Like, how do you even kind of wrap your mind around that? But the thing that has piqued my interest the most is seeing the fact that you have these labor movements that are continuing to happen. Amazon, went through a union strike, or essentially a labor strike, which was to form a union as part of that labor strike. Although largely Amazon kind of put down the labor movement, it was not the end of the labor movement. We're seeing a resurgence amongst Amazon workers. We're seeing General Mills and Kellogg's workers striking. We're seeing striking within the nurses, within nurse unions within the last few weeks. We're seeing we saw the largest exodus of nearly 1 million retail workers, or what's considered low wage, low skilled workers. But ironically, they were magically essential workers during the pandemic. And we are seeing, in other words, the effects of what it looks like for a Fed to continue pumping up an economy, spiking asset prices, largely assets that the folks that I just named do not own. These are not homeowners on a very basic level in a large part. These are largely renters. The homeowners that do exist, that's their primary residence. They're not buying 2 and 3 homes to get rental income. They're not, buying another home for vacation. So these are not folks that have options outside of the primary residence for those that are homeowners. So in other words, that umbrella of what's labeled as working class people. Like, if you got to go to work to put food on the table, then that is what's often deemed as a working class person. So these are not folks that were handed any sort of, certainly not TARP funds. In 2 years, $2,000 went out from the federal government, I think. Or I think maybe 3,500 now. I mean, in 2 years, I think it's closer to 3,500. A couple other stimulus checks. 70% of Black business owners did not get PPP funds in the first round. I think over 40% still didn't get PPP funds in the second round. So we saw equally over 40% of Black-owned businesses shut their doors for good during the first year of the pandemic. So in other words, we've seen and we're living through this constant domino effect of where the Fed is simply essentially propping up the economy by spiking asset prices through hedge fund managers, through the largest banks. It's almost comical when, bankers have so much money that they have to turn down the free money that the Fed is trying to give them. Right. And yet you have average citizens and working class folks that can't even take $1,000 emergency. And remember that stat being promulgated long before the pandemic came along, that the average family couldn't sustain $1,000 emergency. I'm almost afraid to ask where that number is at this point. Is it 500? Is it 200? Is it $50? And 4 million workers quit as of the latest report. Within the month of August, since the month of August, over 4 million workers have quit their jobs. So I think what we are watching is the consequence. And, this may be a modern labor revolution that we're kind of looking at, hearkening back to the labor movements, kind of post-industrial, the industrial revolution. This is when we see the rise of the 9-to-5 workday, where we see the rise of the weekend, where we see the rise of workers' rights and working conditions, favorable working conditions. Shouts out to folks like A. Philip Randolph, and one of the first organizers and forming one of the first black unions, recognized black unions with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It was gentlemen and women like Ida B. Wells as well, that were largely a part of these labor movements because of the egregious working conditions. And fast forward 100 years, literally 100 years later, and I think that we are either on the precipice, we may be in the eye of the storm. Sometimes, it's a little bit hard to tell when it's happening in real time where we are. But I do believe that we're watching a labor revolution similar to 100 years ago happen again. And folks are simply fed up. Folks are simply tired of, allowing the status quo to be just that, the status quo. And watching the Fed largely go unchecked when, frankly, Jerome Powell was front running. I mean, let's just call it what it is. That's exactly, when you have, emails being passed between BlackRock recommending to the Fed what the Fed should be recommending to them to purchase. And surprise, surprise, is already things that they hold in their portfolio. When we talk about the game being rigged, Michael Lewis was demonized when he came out and shouted that on his soapbox, that Wall Street is rigged and the game is rigged. But when you have Fed chairman front running, when you have a Nancy Pelosi ETF,
right.
It is hard. It is extremely difficult to ignore those facts and say that the game is not rigged. But that, to me, that's the real state of the economy. In other words, I think folks are fed up, they're frustrated, they're no longer willing to tolerate what's going on. And, I think we have the Fed to thank for a lot of those sentiments.
Exactly. Fair point. I mean, I always felt that, the Obama administration and the Federal Reserve were picking the winners. And it seems like that's what the populace is now saying, that you're picking the winners. Why does a hedge fund manager gets more value? Why does he more value in its economy or in this country than a regular person? Than a guy who works at Amazon or someone who works for CXS Railcar, someone who works at Walmart? Why are investment bankers and hedge fund managers and real estate developers, why are they valued over everybody else? Those also happen to be the donors to these people's campaigns. They also happen to be the type of firms these politicians want to go work for when they leave office. You look at H.W. Bush, way back when he went and worked for Carlyle Group, which is a private equity firm, when he left office. His vice president, Dan Quayle, worked for Cerberus, a private equity firm. Bill Clinton, he worked for a private equity firm. He worked for a private equity firm. His daughter, Chelsea Clinton, worked for a private hedge fund manager at some point. Al Gore works for
the Clinton Foundation is a hedge fund in itself.
Right. Al Gore works for a private equity firm. George W. Bush's brother, Jeb Bush, worked for Lehman before it failed. So it's always just this revolving door between these types of firms and these Tony sort of firms, like these investment banks and consulting firms. And look at McKinsey and Company, which is in the middle of the opiate epidemic. They were advising the FDA on how to deal with opiates while advising Purdue Pharma and Johnson & Johnson how to skirt opiate regulations. And there's like these firms nothing but vehicles for criminal activity. And there's also have to be the firms that the Obama administration and Eric Holder protected. So are we really a nation of laws after everybody broke all these securities laws leading up to the financial crisis and nothing happened to them? Are we really a nation of laws anymore? But getting to, I guess the subject matter, the Fed spiking assets of Jerome Powell and other Fed governors, front running to me. In my former life, I used to do mergers and acquisitions, and I've looked at a couple asset management firms. And one of the things we looked at was, where these asset managers front running their investments. So, for instance, an asset manager that he put his personal money into Microsoft or Apple stock before the firm bought it. So if you buy a small cap stock or mid cap stock, and then with your personal assets, and right after that, your firm buys a couple $100 million of that stock, it's going to spike the stock somewhat. And it's going to benefit you personally. So it raises the question. I'm not sure if it's illegal, but definitely from an asset management standpoint, definitely against compliance. It's definitely unethical. So it comes down to, are you helping your own, lining your own pockets? Do you own the stock because you like it for your investors, or do you own it because you own it yourself, and does the firm own it because you own it and it's benefiting you personally? It raises those type of questions. So in this example, the fact pattern suggests some of the Fed governors have been buying stocks ahead of the Fed. I mean, I had never even thought of that scenario. I thought they knew better. The other thing is that the scary part is that they've been brazen about it. They haven't even tried to hide it. So I'll just explain to you. I'll just read the fact pattern for 1 second. So according to a CNBC article, this is back in late September, Dallas Fed President Robert Kaplan stepped down from his position following controversy over his stock holdings, and Boston Fed President Eric Rosengren also came under scrutiny, and he announced his retirement. And it says that the controversy has swirled over the issue after disclosures that Kaplan in particular had been executing large dollar trades in big name companies such as Amazon, Apple, and Delta Airlines. And subsequent to the disclosures, both Kaplan and Rosengren said they would be selling their stocks to avoid the appearance of conflicts. And questions were raised before the Fed because the Fed has conducted trillions of dollars in asset purchases aimed at helping markets function, and has bought corporate bonds from mega cap companies, including Apple. And Kaplan says that he did nothing wrong. Even leading up to the prior to the pandemic, there was I think Mr. Mitchell had to step away for a second. I think he had to work with his daughter for a second. She wants to be part of the podcast apparently, but even prior to the pandemic, there was talk that the Trump administration had tipped off hedge fund managers that he was shutting down the economy. Which means if you shut down the economy, the stock market's going to crash because lots of companies are going to lose revenue, particularly retailers are going to lose revenue and earnings, and the value of these companies are going to fall. So the stock market was going to crater. And so you saw hedge fund managers actually get out of the stock market prior to the stock market falling prior to the pandemic. So I was basically saying that it was rumors that the Trump administration had tipped off certain hedge fund managers that he was shutting down the economy prior to the pandemic. But so we saw the stock market started to fall. We couldn't figure out why. And then all of a sudden they announced that they were shutting down the economy. But the Dow hit about 18,000, and all of a sudden it started rising again. So after the Fed announced that it was going to support the stock market and do everything it can to support the market and economy, and that's when you saw people putting assets to work into the stock market before the Fed started buying again. So that's what we mean by front running. The nuance is that we know that politicians and policymakers do get some benefit from being in office. They get inside information, and they do benefit from that. But at some point, it goes beyond the pale. And I think in this example, where it's just out of bounds for Fed governors or Fed presidents to be front running and buying assets before the Fed buys them. And I read a book called The House of Morgan years ago, where it was noted that there were politicians who would set policy to help certain railroads build railroads in certain areas, and they could go buy land in the area where the railroad was going to be built. Would mean that land was worth a lot more after the railroad came to town. And then also we got free railroad tickets. That's kind of like nobody's going to really scoff at that too much, but we know there's some type of benefit outside of their their monthly salary for being a politician, but now you're seeing the Federal Reserve getting in on the act, and it shouldn't be allowed. I noticed that far back in 2017. Let's see if I can show this on my screen. Even far back as 2017, the Richmond Fed chairman Jeffrey Lacker stepped down because he was leaking information to a research firm that was tied to hedge fund managers. Let's see if I can share this on the screen real quick.
While you do that, I'm gonna grab a little. I don't know if you can hear.
Yeah, I can hear.
One second.
Anyway, so I'll just read it. So it says here in 2017 article that Richmond Fed's Jeffrey Lacker stepped down over leak. It says Richmond Federal Reserve Bank President Jeff Lacker resigned Tuesday, acknowledging that he may have helped provide confidential information about a Fed economic stimulus program to a research firm in October 2012. The alleged leak to Medley Global Advisors, which provides reports and market intelligence to hedge funds and asset managers, has been the subject of long-standing investigations by the Justice Department, federal regulators, and a House committee. And he basically said, I deeply regret the role I may have played in confirming this confidential information and its dissemination to Medley subscribers, Lacker said in a statement. So, it's, even as far back as 2017, there was, the Richmond Fed chairman had to step down because, he was accused of leaking information about a stimulus package to a research firm tied to hedge fund managers. So this has been going on for a while, behind the scenes. And he stepped down. There was really not a lot of fanfare about it. Nobody was really brought to justice. There was no repercussions from it. It's just that it seems that in a country where 1 in 3 black men are locked up simply for being black, you have people who can brazenly break laws in plain sight and nothing happens to them. So in the case of Jerome Powell, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, he owned municipal bonds that the Fed purchased amid the pandemic. So I'll read a blurb of that right quick.
Well, just to Ralph, just to let you know, I can hear you.
Okay.
Because I got the
okay. I won't say anything negative about you then. How about that?
I know, right?
Okay. Okay.
Just to interject really quickly too, that one, just to be clear, front running is 100% illegal.
Okay.
Unethical. It is illegal. The hard part that comes to pin down, because it's primarily kind of has to be proven either through an intermediary or if you are the trader yourself, like if you have your own personal brokerage account and you're trading through that account, you're the one that's pulling the trigger on the actual trade, and there isn't any information that would have existed where you can show, well, I had an interest in this company, in this position, etc., right, that led me to this, that led me to this decision,
right,
to take this risk of investing. And it just so happened that I did it, 13 hours before something super beneficial.
Right.
But the hard part, if if you're using a broker, in other words, and the broker is the one pulling the trigger, then it becomes a little bit harder to pin down that person for front running because they aren't the actual trader,
I understand,
or the intermediary.
But I mean, I understand. But what I really meant for people like you and me, who look like you and me, it's illegal.
100%.
So I'm not suggesting anybody front running, but if somebody else that don't look like us be engaged in front running, it's kind of like subjective. Depends on the fact pattern. But for people who look like us, it's illegal. So this is an article about Jerome Powell. It says Fed Chief Powell, other officials own securities central bank bought during the COVID pandemic. And it says Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell has ordered a review of ethics rules for the central bank after an outcry over officials owning individual securities. CNBC found Powell owned municipal bonds of the same type bought by the Fed during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. And it says here that Powell held between 1.25 million and 2.5 million of municipal bonds. They were just a small portion of his total reported assets. While the bonds were purchased before 2019, they were held while the Fed last year bought more than $5 billion in munis, including one from the state of Illinois purchased by his family trust in 2016. So I think the nuances for Jerome Powell is that he actually owned these municipal bonds beforehand. He wasn't necessarily front running, but the Fed was buying bonds that he owned. And I always wondered that, so the Fed announced it was going to buy corporate bonds to open up the spigot during the pandemic to make sure corporations had access to more bonds, to more debt. They could raise more debt to fund their businesses at low interest rates, and also allowed these zombie companies like General Electric and certain other companies who couldn't pay back their debt. General Electric was an example, that company that was the junk status. And there were several companies like GE who had made acquisitions at the height of the market with low interest rate debt. They couldn't. These are bad investments. They basically wasted corporate money and corporate value. They also, while they were using debt to make acquisitions, they were also using cash to buy back their stock and pay dividends. So General Electric and several other companies were basically at junk status, and nothing was being done about it. There was like a lot of corporate bonds, a tremendous amount of corporate debt that was investment grade that was about to be downgraded to below investment grade status. And that was before the pandemic. And so by the Fed buying bonds, which I never heard of such, the Fed buying bonds, the excuse was that they were going to allow corporations to still raise debt and fund their businesses despite the pandemic at low interest rates. So it allowed GE and other companies to continue to borrow debt at low interest rates and also extend their debt. So if debt was due in 2021 or 2022, they could extend it out to 2025 or 2026 and continue to kick the can down the road. So I thought that was odd, but it may have also opened up, gave Jerome Powell cover to then buy municipal bonds, which he owned, if that makes sense. If that makes sense. So once he made an excuse to buy corporate bonds, everybody thought that was a great idea. Of course, especially corporations who own the bonds and couldn't repay their debt. Yeah, let's keep kicking the can down the road. That's a great idea. It also gave Jerome Powell cover to buy municipal bonds, which I had never heard of. I'd never heard of such. Why the Fed buy municipal bonds again? But the fact that they kept interest rates at subpar levels for a decade, it actually encouraged sort of wanton spending and wanton speculation, and encouraged companies to go out and make acquisitions at the height of the market with cheap debt, and encouraged them to go back and buy back stock. That this was like almost like free money or found money, because they were almost borrowing money from banks or from the government for free.
Well, also, let's be very clear too, because when we, when we're talking about these companies like GE, like Google, we're literally talking about even the 1% of businesses. When we look at the stock market, the disconnect between the stock market and essentially publicly traded companies and the rest of everyone else is that you're a publicly traded company, and what we would consider micro cap, even a small cap company doing less than 500 million, certainly in annual revenue, but even market cap itself, that still puts companies literally in the 1% of companies that exist out of all the 20 million businesses in the country, in other words. But these are the type of companies that really had access to commercial operations and commercial both lending and borrowing, what we call commercial cash, essentially bonds for short-term bonds for companies, commercial paper. So the benefit that the Fed was first putting out was for a extremely small subset of the business community. It did not trickle down, like lo and behold, trickle down economics didn't work during 08, 09, certainly post 08, 09. And what was so egregious about it, because it took a congressional hearing to force bankers to start relaxing the lending standards. What a lot of people don't realize is that when they go in for a mortgage or a loan for a business, etc., that there's an internal rate that determines suitability. That internal rate is about before 0809, it was about 1.15 to 1.25. What that means is for every dollar of debt that you've been able to pay, that you have 15 to 25 cents left over. So that means that you're in a great position to be able to pay all your debt and still have some change in your pocket. And it's that change in the pocket that ultimately determines how much your loan will be, and the terms, along with the credit score, et cetera, et cetera. Well, after bankers got the TARP funds under Obama, magically, Jamie Dimon said, well, all of these suitable borrowers just magically went away. We can't find, we're having a hard time finding suitable borrowers. But the thing that they were masking, because it's internal bank policy, is to change the suitability standards. It went from 1.15 to 1.25 to 1.35 to 1.45, meaning you had to have 35 or 45 cents left over after every dollar that you spend on debt. So, let's be very clear that they increased the standards to lending during a time when they were getting free money, and when the economy was arguably at its weakest, and when people most needed the money to remain liquid, to keep their doors open, to keep mortgages paid, etc. So they decided to hoard the money that the Federal Reserve agreed to give them so they could disseminate it to the majority of borrowers. So now we fast forward, 12 years later, and we're seeing the same folks who participated in setting up this structure now front running and spiking those very assets that they've kept out of the hands of the majority of citizens. And
Right.
This is what has really largely led to even the corporate debt levels. There's a huge issue when, a Heinz is starting to default on, a loan, a $20 billion loan. They had to sell off, I think 6% of their division in order to simply pay a loan. And this is when all of a sudden corporate debt levels became a concern. The difference between 0809 and today is that corporate debt levels have been unprecedentedly high. We've never seen this height of corporate debt in history. So it's clear who was able to take advantage of spiked asset prices,
Right.
of even like triple tax-free muni bond plays. We are able to see, in other words, like that there was not this equal disseminating of the assets. Because I think that an argument can be made, and this is the reason I brought it up, that the Fed essentially buying munis, I think an argument could be made if it was available to everyone. If you're able to participate and take advantage of the low Fed fund rate that exists between Federal Reserve and commercial banks, and in some ways we saw that because it was a lower. You can hear my supervisor telling me that.
Maybe you're saying something that doesn't make any sense. Who knows?
If it was equal access, just simply banks. We saw a little bit of that because mortgage rates were unprecedentedly low over the last decade. That's where we saw the biggest, and then obviously the turnout of consumer debt through credit cards, auto loans, and the like. So there was some liquidity that went around, but that liquidity was largely going around by way of consumer debt, not consumer assets. And that's the difference.
Right. But I mean, at the end of the day,
and the people were getting debt.
yeah, but at the end of the day, this policy of spiking assets. I mean, there's no, again, I've said this before. No economist would recommend that. John Maynard Keynes, Milton Friedman, Adam Smith. Nobody would recommend that. And so basically, the people who benefited from it are people who own the assets, or who can actually go to a pension fund and say, I need to raise $10 billion. I want to buy assets ahead of the Fed. So people who own the assets, or that's their business, private equity firms or real estate developers who can buy assets ahead of the Fed and enjoy the benefit of spiked asset prices, and it's not been disseminated to the populace evenly. So I'll let you weigh in on what you think about the Fed's for sort of front running its own investments. And again, there's a precursor to that was that the Fed chairman in Richmond had to step down a few years ago because he was leaking information on the Fed's stimulus packages to a research firm that had ties to hedge fund managers and Wall Street firms.
Yeah, I mean, I think
not a lot was said about when the Richmond Fed chairman stepped down.
Well, that's the whole crux is that I think in general, unless it's a Madoff, unless it's something that is deemed egregious. But I guess for me, after seeing Wells Fargo, I think that was my turning point. When you have a commercial bank that has committed the largest fraud in the history of the country, as far as commercial banks go, and you have a Supreme Court that ruled that people couldn't sue a bank that committed said fraud. To me, anything else after that became par for the course. So watching a Fed chairman admit that they were front running pretty much, and he just goes quietly in the night. What else can you expect when you have a judiciary that already backs theft, public theft? I almost wouldn't expect anything less. And, unless it becomes a concern for the citizenry, and unfortunately, not to get too into the weeds, but it is no happenstance that in this current structure, that the poorer you are, the more you have on your hands to deal with. How many people in their everyday life have the room, the energy, or the energy to care about a Fed chairman, right? How many, other than a flippant statement or a roll of the eyes, how many people have the bandwidth to really even grasp what front running is, or why that's illegal?
Well, that's a nuance. That's a nuance in that. That's a nuance. And what Wells Fargo was doing, something that if it's dealing with consumers can understand. They can also understand the opiate crisis, but nobody's gonna understand front running or an investment bank fobbing off assets to another firm. They're not gonna really understand it because it doesn't affect them directly. So that's a nuance. That's a nuance.
Right, and they don't. How many people really have the like I said, the bandwidth to even take the time to care about that,
Right.
But unfortunately, it would take the voice of the people to push back in order for some consequence, because the law is already on the books. We don't need to change the laws. It's already there. Policy
Right.
already exists.
Right.
The reason we can articulate it is front running because the SEC already acknowledged it. So, like, it was already a part of FINRA's purview. It's already a part of policy that this is a clear violation, and yet, there is no consequence of any note. So, it's not that the laws are not in place. We don't need people to, emphasize changing the law. But unfortunately, when you need people to stand up to tell judges, to tell legislators, to simply do your job, the hard part was getting the laws on the books, getting public policy to be formatted around a judicial process. So it's like the heavy lifting has already been done. Just do your damn job. That's simply it.
Well, I mean, do you think that
is the issue to me?
Yeah, do you think the diplomatic immunity that's been awarded to bankers has now been extended to the Fed chairman? That's basically what they're saying now.
Yeah, that is that there's outside of this resignation, I have yet to hear even financial committee, the financial oversight committee even step up and say, "Hey, we need a congressional hearing with the Fed."
Well, on that,
like what the hell is going on? Meeting.
Well, on that note, I'm gonna try to share a tweet from Elizabeth Warren. 1 second. Okay, can you see that, Torian?
It's still low.
Yeah, you'll be see it. Yeah, you'll be able to see it on the broadcast, obviously.
Yeah.
But it says, here's a tweet from Elizabeth Warren. It says, Fed officials should not be engaging in trades to enrich themselves. I've said it before and I will say it again. Members of Congress and senior government officials should not be allowed to trade or own stocks, period. So it seems like...
Did she tag Nancy Pelosi in that tweet, by the way?
Well, maybe she sent a subliminal. Because she did say Congress. But President Obama said that Congress should not be allowed to. I don't know if he said own stocks, but he definitely said they should not be allowed to engage in insider trading. But he said that. He said that. I don't know if he said they should not be allowed to own stocks, but I guess Elizabeth Warren is taking a step further that if they're allowed to own stocks, they're definitely going to engage in insider trading. You know what I'm saying? It's almost like you shouldn't have to say.
That's literally like the chief of police saying, people shouldn't be allowed to murder people.
Right. Not even the police. Not even the police. Not even the police. Right.
Like, it's like, this is how basic and almost remedial this is, that such a statement that's the equivalent of saying water is wet would be considered controversial. Elizabeth Warren is standing up to the big guys.
But I don't know if there's gonna be a hearing going on. I don't know if she's gonna have a hearing, or if there's a hearing. I'm not sure what'll come out of it. But this is really common sense. This shouldn't be allowed. And the Fed is brazen about it. Like, they know nothing's gonna happen to them. And if she has a hearing, I think it's just gonna be much ado about nothing. That only way you can keep these people from engaging in insider trading, keep them from front running, is to, let's say, you can't own stocks. And leave it at that.
Yeah, that's it's pretty basic as that. It's pretty simple as that. This is just setting up for more egregious behavior. There's no consequence that comes out of this. There's nothing, certainly if no one gets put in any handcuffs, it's just going to be another thing that's swept under the rug that lets those empowered know that they can stretch the boundaries even farther. And they can continue bending and clearly breaking the rules. This is a breaking of the rules, not just a bending and a like, oh, it can be interpreted. No, front running is like it's illegal. Period. Like that's it. It's plain black and white. So this lets them know that okay, well, we can take it a step farther. And where is that? Where is that line? In other words, before the judiciary steps in, before regulators step in, before the elected officials step in and say, not just enough is enough, but it's been beyond enough. Like it's time for action at this point, and some consequential action, because this type of behavior is on a mass scale. It's not just one person front running a couple stocks that was
Right.
in his or her portfolio. This is something that impacts monetary policy. So it literally impacts hundreds of millions of people within this country.
Right.
So you simply front running, it carries a significant more weight than, John Doe in the middle of Ohio that got a hot stock tip from his brother-in-law because he didn't realize his brother-in-law overheard, Alan Greenspan talking about something to someone, and he just had to run and go tell everybody. You know what I mean? This is not that situation. It's not something that, in other words, should be minimized. But yeah, I just think that there has to be consequences in order to, in order for it to show that you can't just continue to push the line, break the line, step over the line, erase the line, and just kind of do whatever the heck you want.
Right.
Yeah.
But this it shows you that if the Federal Reserve is engaging in this type of stuff, why would they? I mean, why would they ever want to stop it? If they're making money from this, they can probably make money from front running the Fed and buying stocks and having the Fed battle, then turning around and having the Fed battle stocks, then they can actually make from working for the Federal Reserve. So everybody wants to be a stock picker now. Everybody wants to buy stocks because it's just almost like found money. And these policies only benefiting a very small group of people and insiders. So why would the Fed ever want to stop asset purchases? Why would it ever want to end QE? Because it's almost like a drug at this point. Everybody's everybody's benefiting from it. And at some point, you think the public could have a weaker moment and say, if social unrest actually happens, I mean, one of these events could be the tipping point that people start to realize, hey, the Federal Reserve and Congress and these investor class have been stealing money from us for years, and they've been getting over like fat rats, while the consumer has suffered. There's while wages are declining, costs have been rising. So people talk about inflation now, but there's always been inflation for the past decade: rising rents, rising costs for housing, things that people need, rising costs for college. But that hasn't really been factored into the inflation conversation. You know what I'm saying? But the populace has felt it. The populace has felt it. So if you're the investor class and your assets are rising, why do you care about if other costs for other things are rising too? But if you haven't benefited from this Fed policy or what Obama called, rising tides will lift all boats. You haven't benefited from that, then you've borne the cost, but not the benefit. And the other thing is that recessions have always been borne by somebody. It's been borne by African Americans first, and every 8 to 10 years there's a recession, and black folks always get hit first. They're always the first fired and the last hired, and so that's why you always kind of try to present this information to our community, present this information to the populace, so they can plan ahead. That these policies were never really meant to benefit everybody. It's been really meant to benefit a very small segment of society. And in my opinion, all the Obama administration did was make sure that the next recession wouldn't be borne by his donor, somebody he wanted to work for when he left office, or somebody he wanted to sleep with. And that's it.
Well, certainly mission accomplished in that regards. Yeah, because it's, I think we've said it time and time again. I think the last time we chatted about it, sometimes I don't know if I'm saying these things online or offline.
On your sleep. I
Exactly,
feel like
right.
I'm in an echo chamber.
The CPI, one of the things that stood out is that, typically the CPI, will fluctuate kind of between, 2.5%. And CPI is simply an average of basket of goods that will, give some sort of guidance to folks that actually pay attention to inflation, to give you a sense of where inflation is headed. But it does not represent kind of real dollars and cents on a local level. So meaning that, if you went to your local grocery store and you noticed your gallon of milk went from, $3 and it went to $4, well, that's obviously larger than 2 or 2.5% jump in that price, right? So if it's, if a CPI is 2.5%, you can best believe that you're feeling the pinch across your basket of goods, which tends to be groceries, gas, consumer products that most folks would consider a necessity to purchase. You're typically going to see a very real dollar and cents bump by 10% or more. So when we see a CPI that was 5.7%, and you see a 10% real dollar and cents bump on the CPI of 2.5%, what do you think folks are seeing in a real dollars and cents way with their groceries, with their gas,
Right.
with their rent? So this is the impact of where spiking asset prices have taken it. And unfortunately, we have been doing this for so long that, just in the last 60 days alone, groceries in some areas have jumped up 60%. Housing
Wow.
has jumped 30%. Rents have jumped up 22% in some places. Gas has jumped up another 30%. So in a very real way, if you now take away QE in a sadistically ironic way, it worsens that situation. You are now faced with a potential in an extreme version. You're looking at a Venezuela. You're looking at a Nigeria, where, on Monday, your gallon of milk was $3, and on Tuesday it's $17, and on Wednesday it's $34. That's, that type of hyperinflation moving that quickly, because now you've taken the rug that the market has been propped up on, that these publicly traded companies that are also the largest employers have been propped up on. The housing market has been propped up on. The auto market has been propped up on. The credit cards have been propped up on. So in other words, in every aspect of consumer spending and consumer borrowing has been propped up and juiced on this QE. And if you take that QE away, because you waited 12 years to do what was supposed to happen in only 2 or 3 years, you've now gone past the point of necessity. And now you've gotten to the point where you can't, the economy has become a drug addict. It has become
Right. Exactly.
a drug addict.
Exactly.
And,
But a couple
if you
things.
take away, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead and finish your statement.
Oh, I was just going to say that if you take away QE at this point, now, just like any other addict that's coming off of drugs, they're going to go through withdrawal.
Exactly. I was just thinking
that withdrawal is going to be in my opinion, and I think in a very real way, not to sensationalize or be an alarmist, but just simply looking at the metrics of the economy, it would be worse than the Great Depression. Easily.
Right. Right. But
Easily
I
worse
was
than the
just
Great
I
Depression.
was just thinking that as far as the drug analogy that we've been talking about the opiate crisis for a while, and
Yep.
now you have people, now you have municipalities actually giving, because people cut, the government's cut up opiate supply. Now you have people ODing on drugs that have not been FDA approved. Opiates on the black market, street fentanyl. And then you have some municipalities, some cities actually buying drugs that's FDA approved and giving it to drug addicts,
Yeah.
so they don't have to take drugs in the street. And you have people giving former prisoners drugs to help them wean themselves off of opiates. So to sort of I wouldn't say prolong the withdrawal symptoms, but to make it less pronounced. You know what I'm saying?
Correct. Yep.
So
Yep.
so
Yep.
there's it really is a fair analysis. We've done a lot of work on, as you know, a lot of work on the opiate crisis, and people who want, municipalities who want money for the opiate crisis but don't want to deal with the withdrawal symptoms. They want the money. They want
100%.
their money, but they don't want to deal with the withdrawal symptoms. They don't want to. They don't want to deal with what's creating a demand for drugs, the hopelessness, and so on and so forth. But on the it's a nuance as far as the inflation, how the Fed even measures inflation. It doesn't use CPI anymore. It uses something called personal consumption expenditures. X energy, something called PCE. And I don't think PCE includes rent.
No, it doesn't.
So they've been measuring. So while people have been hit with, so while you have the investor class getting money has been gifted to them from the government to hoard assets, to hoard real estate, to hoard gas or food or whatever, to basically buy up a lot of supply in certain markets and hoard it and manipulate the prices as they want. That's why these prices are spiking like this. Now we gave the analogy of these cold storage refrigerators that was needed by Moderna and Pfizer after their vaccines were approved. All of a sudden, these the demand went up and the supply went down, so the cost went through the roof.
Yep.
And as Pfizer saw its margins dropping, it said, "Oh, we don't need to store these vaccines at 94 degrees below zero anymore, below Fahrenheit anymore. We changed our mind." But so even the Fed's measurement of PCE was I wouldn't say manipulated, but it was didn't include rent. So it always showed for the past decade or so that inflation was held in check. So it gave them cover to keep up QE. So we can keep printing money and giving it to a very small segment of society, and it's not causing inflation. So you're not going to include rent in analysis, and also if you give it to people and they hoard it and put it in, and go, if you give them $1 trillion a year and they take 999 billion of it and bury it in their backyard and only spend 1% of it, it's not going to spike inflation, but it's going to cause inequality. You know what I'm saying? So that became the silliness of it all. That we can keep doing this because it's not spiking inflation. Well, if it's not spiking inflation, why don't you stop doing it? If your goal is to spur inflation, why do you keep doing this? Why do you keep if you keep putting the analogy I used for a couple of articles I wrote? The Fed just keeps applying Robitussin to a broken ankle. It may make you feel better. It may make you drowsy. It may make you sleep better. But when you wake up, your ankle's still going to be broken. It's still going to hurt a lot. So the QE is nothing but Robitussin, in my opinion.
No, that's literally what it has been. When we again, going back to 08, 09, really the decade is before Bush came into office. Democrats' biggest response to the often echoed critique from conservatives is that Democrats are soft on the economy. They're not great with monetary policy, etc. Although, as an aside, actually, when you look at at least from a lens of whether an economy was in a contraction or a surplus, and you look at the history of that over the essentially the 100 years preceding Clinton, that the economy had a surplus more under Democrats, ironically. So if any conservatives don't listening, don't jump on top of my head. Just kind of reporting the numbers. But after Clinton left office, and Bush inherited said surplus, and this is when we get the rise of everyone and their grandmother started turning into real estate speculators. Everybody was a flipper. Even HGTV has 16 different shows about flipping
Right.
in their lineup because it was so popular. It was almost like the tulip crisis, which was the first speculative crisis
Right.
within the market. So, in other words, like when we look at the economy, you couldn't tell anyone that this was not a time to get rich. In other words, although when you're looking at the actual metrics of the economy, all kind of cracks and creases were showing. Education for one was one of those biggest telltale signs, because even in the mid 2000s, tuition rates were already rising 17 to 18% year over year. And it's like, how can you tell me that wages have only been rising by 1.5%, but education is running 17 to 18% year over year? Like that is not a sign of a healthy economy. But you
That's what
tell
that's what the professors have been saying. That our salaries aren't rising 18% a year.
exactly. So imagine trying to tell folks that, hey, something is wrong here between 2000 and 2007. And
Right.
all of a sudden, people felt like, oh, the crisis, the housing crisis, the financial crisis came out of nowhere. Bankers were just doing this. Like, unfortunately, I can't say it was all bankers. People were joining in. They,
Right.
what did Greenspan say? The exuberant, what is it?
Irrational exuberance.
Irrational exuberance, right? And that's what we were watching in real time. So, fast forward, what Tim Geithner and Hank Paulson put together was a sick patient that had a broken leg. Came in, hey doc, we're a bit broken. What's my fix? Well, here's a cast. Here's a couple of opioids to help deal with the pain. And you should be fixed up in a couple of weeks. And you come back, do a follow up, and we'll check you out and probably take off the cast, and you'll be okay. But instead of that process happening, they came in, and for every follow up, the body continued to break down. Opioids continue to get prescribed, and it's like, you know what? Now instead of Tylenol, instead of Robitussin, we're going to keep feeding you these opioids.
Right. Right.
We're going to keep prescribing these opioids, and now
I think they're addictive, though, right? Aren't they addictive?
exactly, like essentially the economy was turned into a drug addict, a drug seeking addict, because it was ill or misdiagnosed, and it was ill treated during diagnosing. And now we're at a point of that fine line of recognizing, well, it came from a previous injury. We misdiagnosed said injury. We continue to make this person dependent on these bad policies, and now they're addicted to these bad policies. And if we now take it away, this person could, and genuinely, like, people actually die going through withdrawal. So it's not just a matter of, go cold turkey and toughen it up, taking on the chin, all of that rugged individualism, rah rah talk. It's like, no, people actually die going through withdrawals. Hyperinflation would be a sort of economic death, and especially for our community at the end of the day, because like you stated, we're the first ones to feel the pain. We're the last ones hired, first ones fired. We remain to have the highest unemployment rate, even as the rest of the country was experiencing a decline in the unemployment rate. When we looked at the unemployment rate between 2010 and 2016, black men experienced the highest levels of unemployment. They experienced the lowest levels of wage increases. Arguably black women have the closest wage gap between sexes and demographics between black men and black women. I believe the wage gap is between 6 and 8 cents. So for every dollar that a black man earns, a black woman will earn 6 to 8% or cents less than that dollar. So in other words, as much as, Black Girl Magic is a hashtag and, for all the accolades and all of the kind of marketing and I call propaganda of kind of the focus on black women in very real terms, if this economy turns into a Venezuela, all of that Black Girl Magic is not going to be enough to sprinkle away the real problems that is going to be suffered and felt through our community. First, we're going to be the canary in the mines.
I'm glad you brought that up because I guess this sort of so-called gender divide that's been talked about by the media. It seems like if there's any gender divide, it's probably by people who are in the media somehow or tied to the media. But and who gets access to whatever, who gets access to media related jobs and so on and so forth. But women tend to be introspective, and men tend to be looking forward looking. And so, you need both, really. You need both perspectives. Like, so the reason I said it because, men tend to build stuff and they tend to be forward looking. And we've been talking about forward looking stuff for years. I'm talking about for a while now, talking about the economy, talking about the opiate crisis, talking about and trying to parse through this stuff and trying to warn people. But you have people who don't want to listen to black men because I guess there's no, Black Girl Magic means you don't have to listen to black men. But when the economy turns down, not if, it's going to be a fight for resources. And I guess if you don't want to listen to Trump and the GE, at least go watch Beyond Thunderdome, movie with Tina Turner and Mad Max, right? I can't think of the guy name. Mad Max. Basically, these people, Gibson, these people have, I guess, gasoline or something. Or some type of resource that everybody needs, and everybody's trying to get to the resources. It's sort of dystopian, but that's the reality. And now you see a lot of the movies that people are watching, a lot of the books that come out very dystopian-like, and you see people going back reading George Orwell, and the terms Orwellian. You know what I'm saying? That term gets thrown around a lot more because now it's a fight for resources. And, one thing I know about Wall Street is that they're always going to do what's best for Wall Street. So you get a bunch of investment bankers to advise you on how to address the financial crisis. It's going to be something that's going to benefit them directly. And that's how it's panned out. I'll leave you with this, that I think Larry Summers came out with a statement that the Federal Reserve is too focused on being woke and should be more focused on inflation. And Larry Summers is an economist. He's well known, but he's one of the people who advised Bill Clinton, who was one of the proponents of the repeal of Glass-Steagall that these banks bet their own capital. They began to bet their own capital, and 10 years later, we're back to the Great Depression again. So there were these laws that were put in place during the Great Depression that put a governor on these banks and wouldn't let them bet their own capital, from Henry Steagall, Carter Glass, Herbert Hoover, and FDR came up with these laws to put a governor on these banks. And then next thing you know, Larry Summers and Newt Gingrich and others said that's a bygone time now. Now it's time to move forward and let these banks start betting their own capital. Here we are again. So now Larry Summers saying the Fed is being too woke and focused on social issues. They should be focused on inflation. But when the government was printing money and giving it to investment banks, Larry Summers never said a word. He seems to be nothing but a glorified publicist for Wall Street. And so now he's someone wants to sound like an economist and say we should focus on inflation and not focus on social issues, where the Fed knows that it gave was those not social issues when they printed money and gave it to investment bankers and the investor class in 2008? Well, it had nothing to do with economics. Nothing. So you basically chose some people. You picked the winners. You chose some people over others. You picked a certain segment of society over other segments. Those are social issues. Now, Larry Summers, now that it's not now the next recession won't be borne by Wall Street. Then Larry Summers wants to get back to economics and not address social issues. Not address social issues. But he never said a word when the government's printing $30 trillion and giving it to everybody but black folks and poor people. He never said a word.
And that's it, man. That's literally it. And it was no coincidence that he was also during that tenure, he was, if I remember correctly, the highest paid dean at any school in the country as well. So this man was directly benefiting from his economic outlook.
Right. It's almost appalling that this guy even still has a platform, to be honest with you.
It really is. But yeah, I think that's my 2 cents on it. My last parting shot on what this where we're headed, what this economy means, and just in a very very real way, how this affects people's everyday living, not just from a high level or speaking industry language. At the end of the day, this has always been a fight for resources. That fight has grown significantly more distant, and it's only going to get more vicious because even being at the top, you still are going to feel a pinch. When you have, Border Patrol that has backups from folks coming into the country, when you have tariffs impacting ships coming in, when you have, the largest retailers that are chartering their own ships in order to address disparities in supply and need. So in other words, these are the investor class. These are the folks with the assets. If they are scrambling, what do you think is going to mean for those 90% that don't have the assets at all? So, in other words, it is not an unlikely scenario. There are very real threats that, I guess this would be my kind of parting shot, because I think in a very extreme way, if anyone has been paying attention over the last few years, from congressional hearings to CIA reports to FBI reports, that there has been a rise in militias across the country. There have been a rise in overt white nationalists within law enforcement, within the military. Just as recently as 2 weeks ago, one of the most recent reports. So understand that this is pushing folks. These conditions are pushing folks to announce a civil war. And while that sounds like a far off, conspiratorial take, I do not believe that, looking at the conditions being what they are, that is an unlikely scenario. I think that there is very real weight behind that, and the fact that even the NSA is using those sentiments in a very real way, that they are taking this picture very seriously. So I think that folks also should be taking that potential outcome very seriously. What that means in terms of, should you get a bunker? Should you stock up on beans, ammunition, and weapons? Is not for me to say. But in other words, it is the fact that there is any scenario that gives credibility to that being a possibility should let you know the very real conditions and the impact of bad monetary policy and the consequences on the people. And that people, irrespective of demographic, are fed up.
Right.
And they are going to take some action one way or the other. So whether it's through a democratic process and a diplomatic process, whether it's through a physical process, but you can only push people. So not just an economy. You push an economy, you're really talking about people. So you can only push people into a corner so far, so many times, so much before those people you keep pushing start to push back. And that's, that's really where the consequence is going. And
Okay.
if the
Okay.
federal government, frankly, doesn't
Thank
get
you for
their
that.
hands out of their asses, and take that as a very serious outcome and start implementing policies that will make opportunities more equitable across the board. I don't see folks just kind of sitting on their butts and just shrugging a shoulder and accepting the status quo. Like, I think we've seen enough where, I think we've seen enough over the last 2 years what folks are prepared to do if there is not some massive, massive change. This is beyond a new deal, but a new deal would kind of be a start. Like, it's the reason why the New Deal worked under FDR, because they recognized that elected officials got their heads out of their asses. They passed policies that were favorable across class structures. And if there's no type of assuaging class real worries, fears such as jobs, such as opportunities and education and childhood development, etc., then we may have to take those threats very seriously in terms of what folks are willing to do.
Okay.
That's kind of my last parting shot and my 2 cents. Because I just think it's important that folks are aware of what consequences look like beyond just a judicial outcome or a litigious outcome or even a legislative outcome. That what it means in a very real way for real people.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Tori?
And it looks like this will be the end for us. So as usual, we didn't get any questions, as I like to encourage folks, those that listen to us, as we put out this content. If you have questions, please engage with us. We will, respond to the questions during some of the programming, so that way it gets answered, frankly, and we're trying to answer them as best as we can. Most importantly, we'll answer them as honestly as we can as we continue to bring content. I appreciate those that have watched this and remain patient with us through our technical difficulties, as well as with even non-technical difficulties, but difficulties nonetheless. But we'll continue to remain dedicated to the folks that want to hear this type of content and hear a non-corporate media backed take on what's happening at the intersection of real folks and economic policy and monetary policy, and even opportunities that may exist within the markets as well. So be sure to like, subscribe, share if you think this content is worth connecting with folks, even if you don't like them. There can still be something that is of benefit and of worth to pass along, because at the end of the day, not to sound too, I guess, cheesy or idealistic, but we got one planet as far as we know that we are all populated on. So help your neighbors out. Definitely share the content, like and subscribe. Feel free to send in questions, comments. We do read them all. We do engage them all. But until next time, this is Mr. Mitchell and Shock Exchange with Trump and the GE. And we will see you guys again with, I believe, Barbarian number 5 of our Barbarians at the Gate series when it comes to Indo. So be sure to check that out, and we'll see you all next time. Take care.